Magnum Force is the second entry in the Dirty Harry franchise, and sets our grizzled detective against a rogue cop, dishing out their own form of vigilante justice. Today we'll discuss how well the sequel stacks up against the iconic original film. Welcome everyone to the Collector's Cut. I am Peter, and joining me as always is David.
Man has got to know his limitations.
He said that a lot in this movie. That is very true.
I feel like every movie's going to have a catchphrase. I honestly think that's going to happen.
That may happen. So yes, of course, this is Collector's Cut. We work our way through franchises or themes of movies. We are working through the Dirty Harry franchise. It's our first franchise, in fact. This is only episode 2 of the whole thing. So this is Magnum Force, or sometimes is referred to Dirty Harry Magnum Force, just, because they made this weird choice with this franchise to never actually... This is the opposite of today, where they'd always have the franchise name with the colon and then the title. This is just Magnum Force, technically, so...
Yep.
Which, to be fair, like, every time I double-checked I was watching the right thing, like, 3 times, just to make sure I was watching the right movie.
In fairness, advertising-wise, it seems like all the posters and trailers and whatnot say Clint Eastwood is Dirty Harry in whatever movie.
Oh, it'd be easy when it's coming out. It's just a little more difficult years later, because it's like, which one was second, which one was third? Because I very nearly watched The Enforcer at one point, I'm not going to lie, which is the third movie in the franchise. So yeah, this is a podcast, this is a discussion show. We're going to discuss the film. We'll start spoiler-free, as we will always do. It is worth mentioning, though, since this is a sequel, the first movie we do kind of have to just say is fair game from the start, because there's going to be some sort of overall observations that are affected by the fact that this is a sequel, and so we do expect that there will be some spoilers for the first movie, even in the spoiler-free section, so bear that in mind.
Scorpio is Dirty Harry's dad.
That wasn't in the first movie. Harry.
But now we've managed to weed him out. Who it is.
Harry, I am your father. Sounds like I'm mixing up Star Wars and Harry Potter when I say
I was going to say, I was waiting for you're a wizard, Harry.
You're a dirty cop, Harry. R.I.P. Robbie Coltrane, who passed away just this past
oh yes, absolutely.
couple of weeks, actually, who said the famous... I don't like Harry Potter, but I like Robbie Coltrane. So,
oh yeah, he was great.
Yes, so Magnum Force, second outing as Dirty Harry, and obviously the first movie was a hit, that's why they made this. Directed by Ted Post, who isn't a particularly well-known director. I did look him up briefly, and he directed the second Planet of the Apes, so he seems to be one of these workman directors who comes in and does like a sequel for a studio, but doesn't have a lot of notable stuff necessarily on his own. So that is that. Otherwise,
I did look up on IMDb trivia, which obviously notably false most of the time, but there was one that said that basically it seemed like Clint Eastwood and the second unit director, who I didn't get the name of, did most of the actual directing.
Oh, really? Okay.
So,
well, he also listed this director for Hang 'Em High, which is an Eastwood movie. So I wonder if Eastwood just got him the job. Is it like, hey, get this guy because I can push him over, or something? I don't know.
I could just threaten him behind the scenes, whatever.
Maybe it was a friendly thing. Maybe he was happy to be pushed over. Yeah, he's like, hey, I'll.
See, I can't picture Clint Eastwood not being threatening. Yeah, that's the issue.
Maybe Ted's like, I'll take the payday, and I'll just sit around on set eating donuts. I'll let Clint do all the work. I'll take the credit.
Sounds like a good gig.
Yeah. So what I think the first thing to get out of the way with this sequel existing is the end of the first movie, because the end of the first movie, we commented on how all of its themes and all of its ideas about Harry being this out of place cop, the world's changing around him, and this is maybe the last like useful case he'll be on, because this is a very old school good versus evil case. But he fundamentally makes a choice at the very end of the movie to throw his police badge away. He makes the choice to walk away from the life that he's in because he realizes he doesn't belong there anymore. And what's so weird about this is that this movie has this thing where he's on like a stakeout duty and he's not in homicide, and there's a point in the movie where eventually the lieutenant's like, we have to bring in Harry, we need him. It's like Demolition Man, we need an old school cop to catch this old school bad guy. So see if at the start of the movie he was like not a cop and he was just like fishing somewhere, and then he gets pulled back in because the case is so extreme, it would still ruin the overall ending. Don't get me wrong, in the first movie it would still ruin it by bringing him back, but it would be less egregious than what's in the movie, which is he's just a cop still with no explanation.
So there was a brief period. The opening of this movie opens up on some guy tried for murder or something like that, and he gets off. For whatever reason, he gets free.
Yeah, he's coming out of the court, and there's like press, and he's pushing the press out of the way, and all the rest of it.
He's like, oh, yeah, the courts have found the right decision, blah, blah, blah. But it's pretty obvious from the way that things are being framed here that, like, he did do it.
Oh, he's guilty. He's absolutely guilty.
Like, he absolutely is guilty. But there's a part where we see, a traffic cop sort of get up. And we don't see who's putting it on, but we see the TV giving this report being turned off, and then the traffic cop stuff being put on. I'm like, are they doing a prequel? Are we seeing the early days of Dirty Harry? That's my first thought going into that.
No, I actually had a similar thought. I didn't think it was a prequel though. I thought, he took a job as a traffic cop. That was like his way of he's given up the badge, but he's still a cop. He's just doing traffic police now.
Possible.
Yeah, but turns out this is the villain actually instead.
Yes,
because I thought that they were hiding his face because they're going to do this big reveal where he turns around and he's got the helmet on and it's Harry, but it wasn't him.
Yeah, exactly. But no, it's basically set up the same structurally as the first movie, where we just open up on the villain doing this horrible thing, and then we get into the rest of the plot. It's just the eye catch, more or less.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I guess we got to go slightly before that, because there is one thing I have here in my notes, is that the opening title sequence of this movie is a red screen and a hand holding the .44 Magnum.
The most powerful handgun in the world, don't you know?
The most powerful handgun in the world, of course. And it's just holding it as the opening titles go on for about, I'd say, 1:30 seconds. And there's this very, very slow zoom the entire time. And, like, you can see this hand is, like, twitching and, like, struggling to hold this gun up. And I'm like, surely an image would have worked here just as well. But no, they did that for 1.5 minutes. They turn it and aims towards the camera, fires off a shot, and then he says the speech again. And I genuinely was laughing at that point. That we were just like, hey guys, we showed you the gun, but here's also the speech. Just so you know you walked into the right theater. Like, yeah, no, we're just going to tell you right off the gate. No, .44 Magnum. Do you feel lucky, punk? And then movie actually starts. I just found that, I don't want to say, like, ridiculous, but it would be the sort of thing of, like, opening up, like, an Iron Man movie with him getting into the armor and then turning right to the camera and saying, I am Iron Man.
Yes.
It's just a little bit like, yeah, that's why we're here.
I did chuckle a bit at that. I've got some other observations and comparisons to the first movie, and thoughts about the whole thing. But I think before we get into anything, I wanted to bring up, because we said that repeatedly in the first review, that it's kind of weird that this is going to have sequels, even though I know they exist, because the whole arc, the whole point of the movie is that he throws the badge away at the end. And I do think that there is conceptually a really smart thing in this movie, where right away it sets up this villain, this traffic cop kills this guy who got away with murder, and it's like, oh, this is like, the villain's going to be someone who's a more extreme version of Harry. It's going to be a cop who's killing bad guys, and Harry's going to have to stop. And I thought, you know what? Before we get to execution, no pun intended, and before we get to how it actually handles the material, on paper, I'm like, you know what? For a sequel to Dirty Harry, the idea that there's someone who's kind of like Harry but takes it far too far, and in that they're just a judge, jury, and executioner, is actually a fascinating challenge for Harry, and maybe it will make him question how he does things, and maybe have him re-examine who he is. It's not a bad idea, as far as sequel ideas go.
I think that this movie simultaneously can and can't exist without the first movie. Like, the only reason that these villains work is because we know Harry was, like, pretty much down that exact same path in the first movie. How he was like, screw the system. Like, I don't want any part of it. I know what's right, and I'm going to do what's right. But at the same time, like, they basically just ignore the entire driving force of he's an aging cop and the system isn't working for him anymore, and he feels the need to leave. Yeah,
they have to ignore that completely.
Yeah, so it's while it's picking up on the characterization of Dirty Harry, it's not really continuing the theme that's set up in the first one. So it both needs the first one to exist in order to further the character, while at the same time has to ignore it in order to let the plot actually make sense.
Yep.
Strange combo, but I do appreciate the idea of the villain just being, hey, what if Dirty Harry was as bad as everyone thinks he is?
Yeah, kinda. That's I think it's an interesting challenge thematically based on what the character was in the first movie. But I mean, before we go any further, though, I guess just general impressions of the movie. David, how did you feel about Magnum Force?
I enjoyed it. I don't want to bury the lead. I did enjoy Magnum Force as a whole. I don't quite think it had, I guess I want to say, the care and attention that the first movie had. I think that it felt a lot more like, hey, we've got this established character that did extremely well. We have, like, based off of what I was reading, the idea of a vigilante cop was actually one of the original pitches for the first movie. So they just, Eastwood apparently loved it. The director of the first movie didn't. So they went with what became Dirty Harry. But then Eastwood took the idea and turned it into the sequel. So I get that this is something that was there from the beginning. It was something that wanted to be done, but it definitely felt more like this wouldn't have been done if the first Dirty Harry wasn't successful, or at the very least, it wouldn't have been done under the Dirty Harry name.
Yeah.
It would have just been its own separate thing of Clint Eastwood is Mike Johnson. So I do like the movie. There is just some little spark missing from it, and I think what it might be is that this feels more done in terms of I've seen this before. I've seen the thing, like, so many movies. And again, this might have been the one that, like, started off a trend or something like that. But so many movies have this thing of the black and white morality being taken too far, of this one person being the judge and jury and executioner. I've seen this a lot more than I've seen, the aging cop coming out of the system and he's got this one, like, this one just seems a lot more saturated in what I've previously experienced.
I think before you even get to saturation, I think this one's just a bit more schlocky. It's not as deep. It's not got the depth to it. Because, we spent most of the conversation in the first movie talking about the ideas and the themes and what the character represents in the time period. Like, I don't think we can have the same conversation here. There's little snippets of it. There's little things, like, peeking in. But for the most part, the movie's kind of at odds with what the first movie was saying in a lot of ways. So because of that, I think inherently it's more of just a schlocky action crime movie with a badass main character, and that can be fun in its own right. And I think for the most part it's very watchable. It's maybe a little too long. It's like 2 full hours. I was feeling it a bit towards the end. I was kind of like, and I think from a pacing perspective as well, it didn't feel like it ramped up to the finale for me. It kind of felt like it was just, we're in the last 15 minutes, it's time to have what's going to be the ending now. Whereas the first movie, I think in comparison, I think ramped up wonderfully to the moment where, Harry was coming after the villain at the end.
Oh yeah. I think I said in the first one how I felt like it built and built and built, and every single time I thought it was like, this must clearly be the ending, because how could you build any more? And then they just kept doing it. This one, like, there was a scene, I guess about halfway through, where there's a robbery of like a pharmacy or something. Yeah. I don't think that really went anywhere, did it?
No, that was just that was a standalone thing on its own. Yeah.
It just popped in the middle there. It's like, hey, this is happening, and then it just
honestly
went away.
The first half of the movie felt like it stopped to do just standalone Dirty Harry adventures, whilst the overall plot was building in the background. Which actually, one of the things I have to talk, and I know why you're smiling, because right. So in the first movie, we joked a little bit how it's a little contrived and silly that whilst Harry was getting a hot dog, there was a bank robbery across the street that he just happened to notice. This movie, from a structure perspective, copies this exact scene in this one, but holy shit does it turn it up to 11. So this time he's getting a burger at the airport, and he just happens to be there when he hears like a code word at the airport which says there's something wrong. He just stumbles into the back room, and it turns out there's hijackers who are holding a plane hostage on the runway, and Harry ends up like, dressing up as a pilot and going on and like taking them out, and it's a whole sequence. We'll talk about it a bit more. God. But I was like, when I realized, and especially when I clocked, wait a minute, this was him getting a burger. In the last one, it was a hot dog. This is becoming a running thing where he goes to get food, and there's just some crazy, like, villainous thing happening for him to solve. I was like, I couldn't stop laughing. I was beside myself.
I mean, I genuinely expected him, because they put him in a pilot's outfit. He has to fake that he's a pilot long enough for him to get the upper hand on these hijackers. I was half expecting him to walk onto the plane still holding like a burger in his hand. Just being like, hi, I'm the foreign pilot.
Well, even just the way it cuts into it, because he walks into the meeting with, like, air traffic control and the airport security and whoever is in there, and they're like, oh, get out. And he's like, no, I'm a cop. And he shows the badge, and he's like, oh, well, this is the situation. And he's like, he called the FBI. He's like, they're on their way, but it's going to take them like half an hour or something. And he's like, may I make a suggestion? And it just cuts to him in a pilot's uniform walking out to the... And I'm like, in what world would these people just accept that this rogue detective who just happens to be there should dress up and go and try... I mean, I think they say something like the hijackers are like really agitated and they're determined to like leave right now, so they're
they're waiting for a foreign pilot, like an international pilot who can get that distance, and they need that.
I did have a chuckle though, because he sits down in the pilot's chair and he looks over at the co-pilot. He's like, you want to get this thing moving? Because I have a freaking clue what I'm doing.
My favorite part in that whole sequence was once the plane, like, Harry starts pushing the plane forward. It starts to take off. He is going down the runway, and there's a call from one of the people in the back room that Harry talked to his Lieutenant Briggs, who's a major character in this.
Yeah.
He calls up Lieutenant Briggs in the car saying, like, yeah, we were really lucky. One of your detectives was here, Detective Callahan. And you just get a cut to Briggs, who's like, Callahan? And it's like, yeah, exactly. That should be the response here.
Yeah, it just... I couldn't believe how they copied this exact moment from the first movie, but just turned it into like an even more extreme situation.
I mean, I have to assume, because this is a 5-movie franchise, correct? Yeah. Ending with the Deadpool. Yes. I'm assuming in the Deadpool he's going to space. Like, I can't imagine how we can't keep going higher.
I don't remember anything about Deadpool except there's a young Jim Carrey in it as like a rock star.
Really?
That's all I remember. Yeah. It's like Jim Carrey before he did like Ace Ventura or anything like that. This is like 1989 Jim Carrey. So kind of wild in that sense. But yeah, my jaw was agape. So when it got to the chemist store robbery thing, which was kind of weird because they had like a little hiding area and they could see the robbery happening. It was just kind of like, I think it was meant to show that him and his partner were working well together because his partner was in undercover or something.
Yeah.
But other than that, it didn't really accomplish much.
Yeah, I mean, I got it. I started taking notes on this, just of general thoughts, but around, I would say shortly after the airplane scene, obviously, I had to start just writing down the plot beats in the order that they happened, because a lot of these things don't really just inform one another. Like, at one point, there's a scene of them doing like a championship shooting competition, and while for the plot that scene is necessary and for character development,
it does have a purpose. Yeah, it absolutely has a purpose.
There's nothing though that like leads into it. There's nothing, like, at no point prior in the thing do they, barring I think one throwaway line, they mention at no point prior.
They mention it in a much earlier scene, but it's not like on the build up to the scene. Like, there's a big gap between when it's mentioned and then all of a sudden we're at a shooting competition thing. Yeah,
exactly. And then I mean, I don't want to jet too far ahead here, so why don't we move on? So the new partner.
Yes.
Partner Earl, or is it Earl? I think it's Earl. Earl Smith.
I'm scanning the.
All I know is that the actor is well known as Johnson from RoboCop series. So
sure, yeah.
The new partner here, I like the way that they introduced it, in that they kind of just had to do that wink and a nod of like, yes, the first Dirty Harry movie did happen. We're not just ignoring it entirely.
Yeah, he mentions his previous partners teaching at a college, which was hinted at that he would go to teach last movie. So okay.
Yes, exactly. So they never laid it down of it being a definite period of time. They never said that, like, oh, I lost my partner 6 months ago. They were like, no, it's just been long enough that he has followed through and has moved on to teaching. And now you are my new partner. And I think that while they don't really do anything to inform who this partner is outside of who he relates to Harry as, I did still like him. I think he was a decent enough
presence.
I want to say, yeah, presence, because he's just the straight man to Harry's craziness. That's all he is. I don't see this character existing outside of how he exists relative to Harry.
It feels kind of unnecessary in the movie because we already know who Harry is. We don't really need to give him a partner necessarily, but yeah, he's pleasant enough in his role, you know, when he's around. So I mean, I can't really complain too much. As far as other characters goes, here we're keeping spoiler free just now. We got Lieutenant Briggs, who's, you know, hates Harry and just constantly doesn't want him around, but reluctantly brings him in at a certain point. He's like a big character in this, but we see a lot of him throughout.
I vaguely remember in the last movie there was a lieutenant, but it wasn't Briggs.
No, it was someone else.
I think it was a different name. And we commented how we were like, oh, you know, it's a bit refreshing how the lieutenant just doesn't hate Harry. Like, he respects how Harry does things. This movie just 100% goes into like, yep, nope, you're playing by your own rules, Harry, and Lieutenant will not have it.
It's just another one of those things that makes it feel less unique than the first movie does. It's all just more generic. It's still fairly well done for what it's doing in terms of just being an entertaining, you know, action thriller, but it's definitely missing a lot of those nuances and a lot of those little things that just make it feel special. So you got him. You've got a group of rookie cops that are kind of prominent characters as well. These 4 rookie cops that are good at shooting that Harry kind of respects. They're introduced early on. They're kind of a big part of it. And then, you know, there's the odd little other character that pops up. There's a neighbor character. So one of the things that struck me in this movie, it's only 2 really, but like every lady in this movie that Harry encounters, not only do they want Harry, it struck me how similarly they asked them if they were interested, because
I have that exactly written down in my notes here in all caps of everyone wants to take a ride on Harry.
But it's not just that, it's the way they ask. They ask in the exact same way. So earlier on, we're introduced to this character played by Mitchell Ryan, who you might know from Lethal Weapon. He's been in other stuff. He's in Halloween 3 Season of the Witch, I think. Oh, what's that him? Well, I think I'm confusing him with Tom Atkins, maybe. No, I don't know.
Halloween, The Curse of Michael Myers.
Oh, it's Halloween 6. That's what I'm mixing my Halloween movies up. He's in 6. But yeah. And Hal Holbrook, who plays Lieutenant Briggs, he's in The Fog, for the record. That's where I know him from. But yeah, so Mitchell Ryan plays this cop, and he's kind of introduced early on as this cop who's on the edge, and you're thinking, oh, maybe he's the killer because he seems like he might be suicidal. His wife's left him. And then Harry goes to see his wife because he's friends with both of them. And this guy's wife, like, once she puts the kids to bed, is like, Harry, can I ask you a personal question? And he's like, sure, go ahead. And she's like, what do I have to do? Why have you never made a pass at me? Come on, you know. And that's, on its own, that's fine. It's whatever. It feels like she's moving on to like one of her husband's friends like really quickly, given they've just separated. But whatever. Yeah. She's really horny. Whatever. There's a random scene, not too much after that, where Harry's going home to his apartment. He comes in, he checks his mail, and this young, at least much younger than him anyway, Asian woman steps out. She's like 5 foot tall. She's this tiny Asian woman. He's like, oh, you're the cop who lives upstairs. And he's like, yeah, that's right. And he's just being very stoic, because he is. And she's like, can I ask you a question? And he's like, sure, go ahead. What does a woman have to do? Is, you know, spend the night with you? And I'm like, just from a writing perspective, could the writer not have like changed how they phrased this so that it wasn't the exact same thing? Like, because they both start by saying, can I ask you a question? And then immediately just say something really blunt about wanting to be with them. Don't get me wrong. His response here was funny. Like, his response here was try knocking on the door, which she does, like, you know, a minute later. And
see, that was the part where I feel like this was an earlier version of the script colliding with a later version, where I feel like the earlier version had him actually like starting to see and hooking up with his name is Charlie, his ex-wife. And then at a certain point, Charlie just got reduced more and more and more in the script.
Oh, he's barely in it. That's the thing. The scene they introduced him, I thought you're going to be a prominent character that's going to be like this like constant thing that we're thinking about.
And then they talk about him like 3 times.
But he disappears. He disappears until one scene really late in the movie. Yeah.
So I think that this was just different versions of the script colliding, where they're like, we're going to have this whole big backdrop of, you know, I don't doubt that at some point in there, he actually did do a thing with the ex-wife, because when the ex-wife lets him go to whatever he needed to do, which I actually believe was the pharmacy robbery scene, she just plants one on his lips and says like, oh, come back whenever. It's like, have I been doing friendship wrong? I don't think that's how you say goodbye. But then, yeah, again, just a few scenes later, we introduce to this new character, and I feel like the reason that she is so forward towards Harry is because all of the scenes that were given to her in the latter half of the movie were probably belonging to the ex-wife to start with. And they just were just like, it's just, yeah, you know, she just really wants Harry for no particular reason.
Because she comes up to Harry's place, he gets called away, but then when he comes back, she's still there, and they, you know, spend the night together. And then later on, they're on the phone, and she's like, hey, I'm going to pick up something at the market. Can I get you something? And it's like, oh yeah, I've got a key to your place. And I'm like, oh, this is progressing a lot in the background without us not seeing anything. Yeah, it's just it's kind of wild. And obviously there's a moment later on, without getting to spoilers stuff here, where she's in jeopardy. And that's kind of how I felt about every character that Harry cares about. I'm like, yeah, you're probably going to die. You're probably going to die. You're probably going to... You know, I just kind of... I felt that about everyone that introduced to me, because it's like, everyone's fodder to like make Harry angry later so he can like get revenge.
I mean, without there being too many spoilers, but I'm sure you could figure it out. There's one scene about 2/3 of the way through the movie where he talks to his partner about like, oh, I think this, that, and the other thing about the bad guys, and this might be the last time I see you because I'll end up dead. Goodbye, my partner. And the partner's like, see ya. And I'm like, well, definitely one of you is dying.
Yeah, it's... Yeah, so there's definitely some predictability in the movie. There's like a villain reveal at one point, which was the most obvious villain reveal. Like, I
mean, you say that, but without getting too much spoilery, there is a few very strong misdirections in this that while it seems like it's obvious once you're introduced to the villain, who the villain is, there are a couple things in this that at least took me the opposite way ever so briefly.
Okay.
Maybe not like I didn't ever write them off entirely, but I was like, okay, but like maybe it's this other person. And we'll get to that when we get to it. But it is I see the parts where it's like at least toying with the idea of like, okay, but like, do you actually know? It never says, it's never a full turn, it's never a full twist, but it's just planting small enough seeds of doubt where it's like, but are you positive about that?
Yeah, okay. I will say, you know, one of the things we talked about in the first movie is Harry's attitudes on the world and how it's changing, and his reactions to threesomes and things like that. There's actually a funny little scene in this where him and his partner are walking past the 4 rookies, and you know, Harry mentions that he knows them, and like the young partner says hey to them. He's like, oh, do you know those guys? And he's like, yeah, they were in the academy after I was. They're really close friends, you know, they stuck so close together, people thought they were queer, right? So, you know, a bit of a dated, you know,
oh, absolutely,
thought process in of itself. But Harry turns and says, hey, if the rest of the department could shoot like them, I wouldn't mind if the whole department was queer. And just as he says that, like an older cop's walking past and just does this turn like, what did you say, Harry?
And it holds on him for like 10 seconds. Like he's just sitting there like, excuse me?
But in a weird way, I think this was the movie showing that Harry's progressed a little bit, and he's like, I don't care if they're gay, if they can shoot properly.
Like, oh yeah, absolutely.
That's the cops I want watching my back.
But see, that, I know I don't want to get too deep into it, but that honestly is how I feel this entire movie's theming is. Where the first movie was like, he's an old cop, he's can't teach old dog new tricks, like not, and the villain represented that of his perfect adversary in that situation. Now we're taking the morality from the first movie, applying that to the villain, turning it up to 11, because obviously it has to be more extreme, and then we're showing how Harry is yet still opposite to that. So while Harry was outside the law in the first movie, now he's like, I quote from much later on, it's literally him saying, where is it? Oh, look, I hate the system, but I go with it because that's all we've got.
Yeah.
So it's
I think
it's the antithesis of the first movie.
The sad part of this is that I think a better version of this movie and a better version of this specific story is that you have Harry from the first movie. Now, forgetting the fact that he threw away the badge and it's stupid to bring him back after that, but forgetting that part, there's actually a good arc in him kind of realizing that there has to be a line that he shouldn't cross, and that the villain crossing that line is something he should stop. That there's an arc there. There's a very good story about him realizing, funnily enough, what his limitations should be.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's why I think that line was used.
So the problem is, though, is I don't think the movie does a good enough job really setting up that arc for Harry, where it doesn't feel like he changes throughout the movie. Like, he has some lines early on when he sees the victims, and the victims are all criminals or bad people, and he cracks a few jokes about, oh, it couldn't have happened to a nicer bunch of people. But other than that, it's not like he's like conflicted about letting the bad guys get away with it or anything. He just kind of is just always him. So I think it suffers from not having a nice clear arc where he learns something.
Yeah, I mean, we open up with, again, that very clear, if you ignore the opening scene, because obviously that's where you get into the gray area of justice, but if you open up with the hijacking, Harry's first time actually doing something in the movie, it's super clear cut. It's a thing of, the hijackers are clearly in the wrong here, and Harry is clearly in the right. Therefore, whatever he does, the ends justify the means. And only over the course of the movie, as Harry slowly comes to understand more and more of the evidence and like who it's pointing to, that he's like, okay, maybe I should, back off that a little bit. But we don't ever see that from Harry's mind. We only ever see that from ourselves being like, okay, Harry, but like, I guess the biggest issue here is I don't know what Harry's moral code really is. In the first movie, it was the ends justify the means. But now this says that no, it's a bit more complicated than that. But it never goes into what it is.
This is supposed to challenge it, and that's good. That's a great idea for a sequel. But the problem fundamentally is that it never goes deep enough with it and actually gives him an arc. And I'm thinking, we compared a lot of the first movie to like Batman and Joker stuff, and I don't think there's going to be much of that here. But I would say, in the new Batman movie, there was a really great arc for Batman where it's very clear cut, and then he realizes by the end why the way he does things is maybe not quite. It's not the exact same as this, obviously, but why he does things is not the right way of doing it, and he has to adapt. He has to adjust. I don't think this movie has a clear arc for Harry where he learns something like that and really changes who he is. Don't get me wrong, it's great that he is challenged to the idea that maybe, like he can't just have ultimate power as a police officer because he's seen it be abused by these other people who are doing something, they're just going far and beyond and just murdering people left and right.
And honestly, without spoiling it, I think the ending, like the final shock sort of ending of this movie, undermines that entire sort of thing. Because in the end, does he actually learn that? Oh, yeah, for sure. And the other problem I have with the ending is I'm like, and this doesn't spoil anything, all I could think was, how are you going to prove anything? I mean, we all know why you were taking out the person you just did and so on. Oh, yeah. But you have no evidence, I don't think, really, of this. I don't think Harry, I mean, that was back to the first movie. That's really what Harry's moral code is like, if I say it, that's good enough for evidence. And I think the reason why we're judging this maybe a bit harsher than you may think, because you could probably say, oh, it's just, it's a fun, dumb action movie. And that would be fine. But the problem is the first movie wasn't a dumb action movie. The first movie, despite that on the surface, it seems like, oh, this old school tough cop who does what he wants. And you could see a lot of people like idolizing him for maybe the wrong reasons, and that's like a problem you have sometimes in media when you have characters like this. And maybe this sequel is kind of born out of that because it's made for the people who idolize him. I think that first movie, once we actually dug into it, it's like, no, this is actually saying a lot of things and it's poking at a lot of questions. It's actually a lot deeper than that, which is why I think you then judge the sequel up to that standard and say, no, this doesn't really say much. It kind of has the elements that it could say something,
but I don't think by the end it really is saying anything great or is really tackling the subject properly, even though the building blocks are kind of there to do it. They just don't utilize them correctly.
Honestly, it strikes me the same sort of way as like someone who is trying to make the argument against something, but they don't wholly believe it themselves. Like, it strikes me because they mentioned very early on in the movie about Brazilian death squads, of the police who are just taking all of this into their own hands and are becoming judge, jury, executioner. They make that direct comparison, which only happened a few years prior to the release of this movie. I feel like the way it was written was them saying, like, obviously that's wrong. Obviously they shouldn't be doing that. But then when they, like, really come down to it, they're, like, pressed on it of, like, okay, specifically why is it wrong? Like, where do you draw the line? They're like, well, I mean, they did some stuff I agree with. And it's just like, okay, but like you can't have that give and take there. You have to come down, especially with this black and white as Harry plays it, of like, no, these if Harry is always to be in the right, anyone he goes against has to be in the wrong. There can't be that little area where Harry's like, I mean, sometimes some people do deserve that sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think the reason why it works in the first movie is because the guy, like, literally was not stopping. He couldn't be stopped, and it took Harry... Like, he had to come in and stop him. Whereas in this movie, the villain is going after, like, everyone who's, like, who... Like, yeah, they all understand. Like, all the cops know that all these people are guilty of things. Some of them much worse things than others. And obviously there's an innocent bystander or two along the way, which obviously makes it even more just outright evil and villainous.
But see, that's what I'm thinking. I think that Harry doesn't really care until the innocent bystanders get involved. Like, as soon as that happens, he's like, all right, now hold the phone. We're not talking about pimps and drug dealers and murderers. We're talking about innocent bystander. And that person breaks my code. Yeah.
So, it's just not as layered. It has enough of the building blocks in there. It can almost look like it is at a glance and pretend to be, but when you actually stop and break it down, it doesn't quite there. And then on top of that, just from like a technical filmmaking perspective, I think it looks pretty good. I think there's some nice little moments of direction. There's a moment where they go into like the ballistics room, and there's this like sort of like top-down shot that lasts for a long time as like Harry and the lieutenant are talking. There was little like flourishes like that were quite good. But I think from a pacing perspective, it does suffer, and it doesn't really have this like great building momentum going into like the final act, I would say.
Yeah, no, there's a whole subplot in here where they're looking for suspects, and Harry is put to follow a guy named Palacio. And I have like a half page of notes here about like, okay, he's on Palacio, he does this, he does that, he does the other thing. And then it just doesn't go anywhere. Like, it ends up wrapping up that plot, and it's just like, all right, but none of that was actually important. The rest of the plot is over here. And I just feel like it came down to they needed a big action scene at the end of the second act.
Yeah.
And so they just had to stick that in there.
I mean, it loosely ties in one small way, but yeah, like...
Just the smallest possible way, though.
No, I agree. You could have definitely cut that down. There's definitely some of the random, like the chemist's, scene where they stop the robbery. That could have been taken out. I think we could easily sit down and cut like 20 minutes out of this movie, and everything would make sense.
I don't even think it needs to be cut down particularly. It just needs to be more well related. Like, there's one point where when Harry's given the assignment of following Palacio, he straight up says, like, this guy could be the next target. Like, this guy could be the next...
honestly, I thought that's what it was going to do. I thought, while he's following him, like, they're going to, whoever it is going to target this guy. Which, actually, I mean, given if you know the rest of the plot, it wouldn't make sense if the perpetrator tried it. But, yeah, that's what I thought it was going to do.
I thought it was going to have a scene where Harry, like, straight up tells him, like, hey, look, I don't like the way you do things. I don't like how you operate, but currently there's somebody who's going to try to kill you, and we're after that guy right now. So, and just having a little bit of a thing where it's showing that
might have been quite interesting, even just showing him having to interact with them and like stay in a room with them. like because he's protecting the scumbag, you know.
Yeah, exactly. But in the end, all it came down to was just this one tiny little relation to the entire rest of the third act, and honestly, it just seemed throwaway for the most part. So, yeah. I think this could have benefited from us focusing on one or two major, like, well-known bad guys who we are led to believe are being targeted, and then following them throughout the thing. Instead, we cycle through like 4 or 5 different ones of them, and we don't really get to know any of them.
Yeah, none of them are prominent characters in any way, shape, or form. And there's at least one early on. I don't even think they established what they did that was bad, at least before they get killed. Because I was like, there's a pool scene, and I was like, okay, I get like that they're probably bad people because they've all been bad people, but nothing actually established like what type of bad person they were. You know, because the opening scene was like, this guy just got out of court and he was acquitted of murder for, you know, technicalities, and he's clearly guilty. You know, it made it very clear what this guy is. And then there's like a pimp who, like, you see how awful he is to his prostitute and all the rest of it. You know, so
by the way, the pimp was actually the same actor who was on the receiving end of the "You Feel Lucky" punk from the first movie.
Really?
Yep.
Is it maybe the same character, or is it just like a...
No, he apparently shows up through multiple different ones of these franchises. We're going to keep on seeing him as different characters.
That's kind of neat, I suppose. Yeah. I did think the portrayal of the pimp and the prostitute was a bit on the dated side.
I mean, but it is dated, so...
Yeah. You know,
I don't know. I obviously those stereotypes come out of some period of time. I don't know what the overlap is with this movie. Yeah. So
it was very the dialogue, you know, everything about it. Even the pimp's car made me laugh because it was so over the top. You know, he's got the furry seats covers. He's got the convertible. I mean,
I
think
different colors. His trunk is literally fur.
Yeah, there's like
the external of his car. I don't think it would survive one rainstorm.
I don't think the top was actually a leopard print per se, but it was something like that. It was like a different you know, material and color. So you know, just you've got an image in your head, right? You know, I think just as we described that. So I think we'll probably give the spoiler warning so we can start just freely bouncing around and talking about what happens in the movie.
Yep.
And all the murders and stuff that are in it. So, full spoilers for Magnum Force from this point on. You have been warned. So, yeah.
Okay, so Charlie dies. Dear Lord, I needed to get that out. Whew.
Charlie's the cop who we meet early on, played by Mitchell Ryan, whose wife is into Harry. And he is set up as this character who is begrudged. You know, he's upset. He hates the system as much as Harry does. And you know, he's even more so. He's a red herring basically, because it's like, oh, he could be the killer. He could be the one that's going and offing people because he's pissed that his wife's left him. He hates the system. You know, like it's really setting him up that he could be the guy, to the point where Harry even thinks he's the guy until he's killed as a bystander during a scene
by the actual guy.
Well, one of the actual guys, as the you know, the big twist being that all 4 of the rookies are the hit squad, so they're all alternating. Which one of them is doing it?
Yep.
So,
I mentioned before that there was a few little red herrings in there that kind of threw me off. The one that really got me in terms of, because if you haven't seen the traffic uniform, it is pretty much covering all identifying features.
It's basically think a T2, think a T1000. Not at the start of the movie, but once he's got the motorbike and the helmet and the sunglasses.
Yep, it's just a big white dome, big sunglasses. You can't tell much, but there's one point before the reveal technically happens. I think it's when he's talking to the pimp, actually. They do a close-up on just his eyes. It's the sunglasses. You can't see anything past that, but you can see little tufts of hair on the side, and they are very clearly gray hair. So when I saw that, I was like, okay, none of the rookies are that young. Could this actually be Charlie? Looking back on it now, I don't know if that was supposed to be just a direct red herring where they show you something that doesn't exist at all, or if it was actually supposed to be, shock and awe, the lieutenant who was also in on the whole thing.
Who turns out to be the ringleader who's like directing these 4 rookies to just kill whoever he deems to be guilty enough to be killed. Yeah, obviously, like they end up killing a cop who's like an innocent bystander.
I mean, I would argue that like during that pool scene, there were a bunch of
that's true
girlfriends and stuff. There's a lot of people who could be considered innocent bystanders, but technically, if you want to get to the moral code, they're all associating with known bad people.
Yeah, but how many, like, there's a lot of, like, topless women there, like, how many of them are just paid to be there because they're rich criminals that are hiring them? Like, they could be very innocent in that pool scene. Because that was absolutely the thing. So the first kill is the murder from the start, where the traffic cop pulls them over and just pulls out his gun and shoots everyone in the car. The second time, he throws, whatever one of the four it is, goes into the bushes next to this pool party, throws in, like, a briefcase that has, like, gas releasing from it or smoke, and then just opens fire. Very mass shooting style, to be honest. This was something that felt like, I feel like movies wouldn't do this too much now because it evokes too many like real world things.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, they literally had two hijackers on a plane going to New York.
I didn't even notice it was New York, but
it was New York.
Okay, well, fair enough. Luckily, they never took off, and it wasn't for like religious or political. This was purely just a ransom.
Yeah,
hijacking, but so you have that scene which is separate from the killings, but the third killings is the pimp, and there's quite a bit of setup for this one because you see the prostitute like leave like the hotel or whatever, get in the cab. There's like an extended sequence of the cab driver like sort of like looking and licking his lips and like woman.
See, you say there's quite a bit of setup, and yes, I agree there's quite a bit of setup to him being murdered, but this entire subplot felt so separate from everything else.
Oh no, it absolutely is. But like, I just mean in the sense that you spend a lot of time with her and then the pimp with her before he eventually dies.
Yeah.
Because you know, like, and she like gets into like the cab driver like perving on her because she starts teasing him by opening her legs a little bit and stuff. And then when she gets out of the car, the pimp comes in and starts slapping her around and like, oh, where's my money? And he's like pulling the money out of all of her orifices that she stuffed it. And then kills her by, I think was it drain cleaner he puts in her, he pours down her throat. And it's like, okay, so this guy's awful, alright, so he's probably a victim soon. Maybe
but it's like the next scene, like there's no time waiting.
You have to wonder if like the reason why, because the victims before this are like, okay, high profile murder case, crime boss, you know, stuff like that. This is relatively small fry in comparison. I wonder if this is like, oh, did the cab driver like give like an account to one of these like four officers? Like when he ran away and presumably got a cop, is it one of them that he's spoken to, and that's why they've picked him for a target? I don't know.
I mean, I don't know. It's clearly when it got to the morgue, they heard the whole story. Like the guy in the morgue recounted the whole story, saying like, oh, he was shot point blank. He must have stood about here, and they put together that it must have been like a cop because he had his driver's license and a bribe out.
I didn't like that detail because when he gets pulled over and he holds up his driver, there's just $100 bill just sitting next to the license for him to take. That's just clearly how he deals with these situations.
Yeah, I mean, as soon as he pulled over, he says like, "You must be new." So, but yeah, no, it's. I think that it was something that they knew about. I don't know. See, that's the sort of thing of they made a comment offhandedly during the scene where Harry is brought to the morgue, and they're just walking down all the victims saying like, hey, this guy did this thing, this guy did this thing. And then they remark on how it is seemingly getting to smaller fry people. Like it isn't as big targets anymore.
I guess that implies that almost like they decided to do this for the first time because this guy who is clearly guilty of murder, almost like the first one was kind of like the bad guy from the first movie where this guy is guilty, he's getting away with it, he might do it again. You could almost say that in the same way Harry went after the guy in the first movie, we could maybe argue as an audience that this is somewhat justifiable, at least in movie terms. But then they start working their way down the food chain, and it kind of lines up with what Harry says later. Like, where does it end? Like, do you start killing people for jaywalking? Do you start killing people for having traffic violations? Like, where do you keep going with this? Because you keep going further down the ladder, and like, where's the end?
And that's the sort of thing where I'm trying to figure out. That's why I think it bothers me with Harry's moral code is that he asks that question, but he never gives an answer. He never says where he is. clearly there is some level of acceptable loss on his side because he packs a 44 Magnum.
Joe would have been a good ending, actually, and this would have answered that question, is if he chose not to kill the lieutenant at the end. If he like made a choice to say, you know what, I'm not going to kill him because I've learned some kind of lesson, and this is not the answer.
It's like, yeah, this is... And honestly, I mean, you could take that... I'm sure at this point, they were like, hey, Dirty Harry makes money, so we're going to turn this into some sort of a series.
Franchise, yeah.
So I'm sure, like, they could literally have just redone the first ending before, where he's like, hey, for those who don't know, there was a whole chase scene, the 3 remaining motor cops, because one of them got killed in an earlier scene. They're all chasing Harry around.
On a boat. Because they end up in a pier, it's a big ship, so it's a really dark ship. There's a lot of... And it's not... Honestly, it's one of the least fun sequences of the whole movie, because it's just... There's not a lot of... I don't know, not a flow to it, I guess.
There's like 1 or 2 good shots of cinematography that I like. Was like, oh, that's very impressive, but beyond that, not much else. But yeah, he just beats through the 3 of them, and then the lieutenant, who he beat up earlier, shows back up, and basically tells him, like, hey, I'm going to go back to the station. I'm going to report you as having killed 3 cops here. It's my word against yours as to what actually happened. And we'll get to it, but for a reason, there's a bomb in the car.
Chekhov's bomb.
Yeah, exactly. Harry sets the bomb to go off with the guy inside of it, and it blows up and he just walks away, thus making it so Harry gets off scot-free somehow. Like you said, still no evidence to that, but
yeah, I mean,
somehow
look at it from the outside. Like, he's just killed 3 traffic cops and a lieutenant, his superior. How does he explain this? I
mean, I guess via that method, if you really try to apply logic to it, both endings would be the same of either he lets the cop go and he's like, no, I have to let the system do its thing. That's me learning my lesson, however that turns out. Or he kills his cop and he's like, okay, I still have to let the system do its thing because I have no evidence that I was innocent. So maybe if you view it through that lens, it is him being like...
Which, honestly, the most true thing anyone says in this movie is when the lieutenant said, as he's backing away, he's like, hey, like, it's my word against yours now, and no one's going to believe you with your record. I thought, yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, absolutely.
Harry's got a pretty rough record when it comes to this sort of shit. No one's going to believe him. This is very true.
So, and then there was... I guess the only difference between the theoretical ending and the ending that actually happened is, like we said, Harry is still... the jury and executioner here. He, like, yes, it is undeniable that Harry is in the right and Briggs is in the wrong.
And he's relatively backed into a corner, which I guess is meant to make us justify it as an audience, whereas, like,
absolutely,
if he doesn't do this, then he's going to be framed for all of it and probably be put away for murder.
Right. And that's its own thing. However, he's still doing it.
Yes.
He's still killing his lieutenant because he personally would not be okay if he did not do that. It's the same thing that he was just saying that he shouldn't do. Now, mind you, the morality is a lot more clear. But even then, the only person that I think Harry had a problem with dying by the hands of this squad at all was the officer.
Yeah, Charlie, yeah.
Was Charlie, exactly. All those other people, I feel like Harry had been like, I mean, I'm not going to join you, but whatever.
Yeah, because the other big kill scene, it's a little bit later on, so it's basically during or maybe after, because it's when all these different cops are all surveying different criminals that could be the next target. So Harry's like chasing around this other mob boss, but there's these 2 other cops that are spying on this other mob boss in a hotel or something. And for some
penthouse.
And for some reason, this is another kind of connection to the first movie. So in the first movie, there was that scene where they're doing a stakeout, and this couple arrives at a guy's house, and it's like, oh, they're going to have a threesome. Here, this mob boss is having a threesome with a guy and a woman, and there's like, he's sort of like yelling at them about not spilling the cocaine and stuff like that. But yeah, it's like this weird menage a trois that he's into. So whatever. But that's going on, and of course, like, you know, one of the corrupt cops shows up at the door and shoots them all. And the 2 cops who are staking out from across the street are like, shit, they put down the donuts, we need to run down, because they're both like these fat cops and they're barely getting there. And it sets up that there's a traffic cop who was on the road, and that kind of explains that, oh, that's whoever it was that went in and did this kind of thing.
That was Officer Davis.
Yes. So it's like, okay, right. So you're setting this stuff up, and this is where it kind of reveals to us that they're the ones doing it, or at least he is, because he takes off his sunglasses at the end of the scene, and it's like, okay, dun dun dun, it's him. You know, and
No, continue. Yeah.
I was gonna say, and it's just after this, I think we get to the shooting competition. So we know that Davis is one of either the killer or one of the killers, and he's like taking on Harry at the shooting competition. And Harry's starting to suspect things because he actually takes one of his bullets to like do ballistics on to see if it matches one of the murder victims. But we get this extended sequence where they're doing the shooting range, and then they do the I don't know what you call it, where the targets pop out and
they said combat. That's all I got.
Yeah. It just makes me think of Police Academy, because that's like, you know, I think of Tackleberry, you know, doing these action roles and stuff. But yeah, what made me crack up about this scene is so Officer Davis goes out and does it, and it's basically perfect. He shoots a bunch of the bad guys with the guns, and obviously it occasionally it pops out like an old woman with like a bag of groceries, you would call it, or a cop, right? And it's like, oh, you don't shoot those, but you shoot the bad guys. Harry goes and does it, and he's doing really well until the very last one, where you can sort of tell he's probably shot someone he wasn't supposed to, and it's the cardboard of a cop. And it cuts to the crowd, and there's just this tall guy who goes, he shot a good guy.
Not only that, but it's immediately followed by like, time 36 seconds, but I'm sorry, Harry, you shot a good guy.
It was hard not to, like, I don't think the movie was gunning, no pun intended, for this. But there was occasionally I felt a little bit of like the this is why we need good guys with guns, because there's bad guys with guns attitude. There was a little bit of that throughout the movie, and it's hard to like not see that in especially like older action movies, because it's just like inherently it's part of it, because it's about like a good guy who's going to like ultimately kill all the bad guys, and we're there for the fun of that. It's just how you tackle it, and obviously we tackle it a little bit differently in modern movies, and like we usually put them in a corner where they have to do it because it's like there's no other way or something. Whereas you know in these older movies, like Harry, is like justifiable causes, you know, a twitch. It's like, all right, okay, the Magnum's coming out. kind of thing.
Absolutely. So just on that scene, one weird little thing that just popped up in my mind. So after that, we get basically he does some investigations on the ballistics of that bullet he pulled, and he comes to the conclusion of, I'm like 95% sure that it's Davis who's doing these things. And he shows the bullet to Briggs, who asks him like, where did he get this bullet? And he's like, oh, it's probably nothing, I'm just gonna keep it on the download for now. So Briggs knows that he's onto them and everything else. And so the remaining motor cop,
and at this point he's already said to Briggs in another scene that he thinks it's a traffic cop or someone impersonating a traffic cop. So at this point, between that and the bullet, Briggs is really concerned, presumably, like, oh, he's on the right track. He's going somewhere with this. Yep.
So the remaining traffic cops all come up to Harry in the parking garage and basically offer him a place on their team, saying like, yeah, you think like we do, you should come on in. And he turns him down.
They basically admit, because he says, oh, you guys have, you know, killed 12 people in the last week, which is Harry basically admitting that he is on to them, and then they immediately go, and next week we'll kill 12 more. So they've just admitted to him that they are doing this. But it's it's in the shadows, they're in the parking garage, and it's like they're all in shit, you know, they're all lined up with the helmets and the sunglasses. So it's very intimidating. It's very much like,
absolutely.
If you don't give them the right answer, they'll probably gun you down right now, kind of moment.
Yep, but he still says no, and they just ride off. And immediately he heads into his apartment. He goes and relaxes for a second, but like he thinks someone's broken into his apartment. He goes in, gun drawn, he looks around everywhere. And then he's like, okay, so no one's in my apartment, but then he hears movement outside. And this is where it comes back to the shooting range scene, is that he opens the door and there's an old lady with bags carrying groceries just walking down the hallway as he opens it up. And he's got his gun like trained on her. He is about ready to shoot, but he's like, no, that's not who I'm looking for. What he's actually looking to shoot is a cop. It's like poetry, it rhymes.
Yeah, no, I did actually, see when they were doing the shooting range thing, I did actually note that, because even at that point, before you get to later on, the idea that the villain in this movie is a cop, and that's who he ultimately is going to have to shoot, like, that was impossible to not notice that, like, foreshadowing with that scene. Because they see it as, oh, you shot a good guy, you made a mistake, But Harry at this point is already thinking, no, the bad guy in this case is a cop. So
Right.
like that's what I'm looking for. It's an okay little touch, you know. It's like yeah, like.
So just to continue on that scene, he then immediately realizes. Oh, go ahead.
Just a bit of preface here. The neighbor that he's shacking up with right now has already said that she will check his mail when she gets in because she's got a key.
Yes. So he immediately runs down the hall, sees her about to open up the mailbox, and then basically tackles her out of the way because he suspects there's a bomb in the mailbox. And so he starts dismantling the mailbox. Another neighbor comes by saying like, "Hey, you're tampering with the mail. You shouldn't be doing that. I'm calling the police." And so he ends up pulling out the bomb from the mailbox, and he calls up Briggs and says like, "Hey, I just found a bomb in my mailbox." But of course we need to cover the scene before that, where before he calls Briggs, he tries calling his partner.
Yes, who unfortunately does open his mail and gets blown away.
Yeah,
yes.
Which again, I can't see this character existing outside of the relation to Harry.
Well, he's got a wife apparently.
Yeah, he does, which showed up for one scene, and we found out that she's apparently a good cook. However, all of that related in inviting Harry to dinner.
Yes.
Like, this character, like, with the first partner from the first movie, they had wants. They had dreams. They had stuff that they did before they came to the academy. They had stuff they did after they left the police force. They had a wife.
I love
a whole bunch of different stuff.
I love the idea that Harry turned down the invitation to dinner because he's like, "No, you're my partner. You're probably die, so I don't want to get attached. I don't want to get attached to you."
I mean, that was literally the first line he said to him. Was just like, Earl is asking like, "Hey, what are those guys talking about?" It's like, "Oh, probably placing bets on how long you're going to stick around as my partner."
Also, his name is Early, not Earl. Funnily enough,
apparently it's short for Earlington, which he also called him Earl at various points.
Okay.
There's a lot to it. But yeah, so partner ends up dying in that scene. And honestly, in that moment, like, as it was happening, I was just like, let's see, did he say goodbye to Harry already? Yes, he did. Is he literally right next to the phone? No, he's still quite a distance away, so that's out the bag. And is there anything around to stop him currently from opening his mailbox? No, there isn't. Goodbye, Earl. We barely knew ye.
Yep, that's pretty much that. Although him dying meant I thought the neighbor who he's kind of like maybe in love with, or at least shacking up with, she's probably safe now because we've killed the partner.
You say that, but at the same point, she never shows up again.
No, she doesn't. No,
she has served her purpose, and now she's gone.
She was there to be in threat for a moment, but then when Briggs shows up, he's like, "Okay, let's go. You can drive. I want to examine this bomb." And then very quickly he pulls a gun out and says, "Yeah, we're not going back to the precinct. You know, like we're going somewhere where we can get rid of you." And he's like, "Yeah, I'm behind all this. You know, we killed the bad guys." And that's when Harry starts talking about the system and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And this leads us into our final bunch of sequences, which is the chase around the ship, and eventually Harry like turning the bomb back on as Briggs drives away, thinking he's getting away with it all.
Now, I will say during the chase scene, so he's being chased by one of the motorcycle cops while Briggs is in his car as well. He knocks out Briggs at some point, manages to toss the gun, but he still has to outpace the motorcycle cop. This was, I think, the only scene in the movie that gave me that same sort of feeling that the first movie gave me of San Francisco being the real city.
Oh, the character of the city, yeah.
Yes, that was present throughout the entirety of the first movie, where I feel like in this movie, it definitely felt a bit more separated.
It's funny you say that, because there was one point halfway through where I went, "Oh, what city is this in again?" I actually forgot what city it was.
Exactly. This was the only point, because they did like all the winding roads, they did like the hills that San Francisco is known for, and they really took advantage of the geography more so than I think any other point in the movie.
They do use the bridge at one point. The Golden Gate Bridge does pop up like halfway through.
But even then, I think it's only when the Pimp is driving across it, and the rest of the scene takes place after he gets off the bridge.
Yeah.
So it's not a major like feature point of working with it.
Don't Harry and his partner go across at one point, because they mentions they're going to be outside of their jurisdiction when they
say the bridge. they're talking about Golden Gate, so be it, but I didn't actually see it as Golden Gate.
True, yeah, maybe it wasn't Golden Gate. I assumed it because it's the only bridge I know in San Francisco.
Yeah,
so.
that's fair. I mean, same.
Yeah. It's kind of a frustrating movie, and I think it's perfectly watchable, and it's got entertaining elements. There's definitely scenes that some of it's kind of laughably stupid. Like, again, he's at the airport getting a burger because he just likes this guy's burgers, and he's there when there's a hijacking going on. There's very predictable elements, but at the same time, there are some well shot moments. I do think that the idea of having like cops that are corrupt as the villain for Dirty Harry in the sequel is a good idea, but the story of Dirty Harry was that he gave this up, so it's just weird that he's still a cop. Still,
I mean,
why?
even if we let that go, even if we say, okay, Harry, he found God or something like that in between movies, and he came back to the Force, whatever you want to call it, that he came back. I still think, even with accepting that change, the execution's still just lacking.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think the building blocks are there for something a bit more poignant, but ultimately it never wants to be more than just a cool movie where Dirty Harry is a cool guy and takes out the bad guys. It never wants to be more than that.
I think that they realized that it was necessary to the story they wanted to tell, but I also think that them working in all of the gun stuff this movie was 100% them just wanting to be like, we're going to fire so many more guns this time. You have no idea. We're going to go through the whole thing. We're going to have a shooting range. We're going to have a shooting competition. We're going to go over the ballistics of stuff.
It's called Magnum Force. Like, it's in the goddamn title. It does kind of feel a bit like super franchisey, where we're really going to milk the details that people talk about from the first movie. So because that speech where he brings up the Magnum is a big part of that first movie, this movie has to, like, it's almost that legacy sequel thing that we complain about a lot now, where we can't just have the Ghostbusters have a proton pack. We have to like do 100 close-ups of it and talk about it all the time. There's a little bit. It's not as bad as that, but there's a bit of that in here where they're really milking some of the known elements of Dirty Harry. And so he's almost a little bit less of a character and a little bit more of a caricature than he was in the first movie. So it's just a bit more hollow and a bit more shallow as a result. So very watchable. Yeah. But, some pacing issues, and it doesn't really hold up that much under scrutiny, so...
Yeah, and I mean, cinematography-wise, we really praised that last time of them getting some really cool shots.
Yeah. And it's not bad this time.
No, the only ones that really jumped out at me, though, were that there was one shot at the very beginning when the motorcycle cop pulled up to the car, and they attached a camera to the side of the cop's motorcycle, and they had it so he was holding it upright. But then he, put it on its kickstand, and the entire shot just tilted into that Dutch angle. And I was like, okay, that did a great job of setting the scene of like, no, this is not how you expect it to be. We're changing up the way that it's supposed to go. And that was told all just through that one shot.
Well, what's funny is
beyond that, there's only like 2 or 3 other shots I can even think of in this movie as being standout.
What's funny is that a lot of the early stuff with like, it's okay, we've got this like cop who's stopping people and murdering them. It was making me think of a movie that came later, Maniac Cop, because that's the premise of that movie. You've got this like psychotic cop who's pulling people over and killing them. No, I think in that movie he's not technically a real cop.
Whatever.
But it doesn't really matter. The point is that he's got a car and he's got the outfit, and people are like lulled into this false sense of security, and he's just murdering them. This obviously is doing something a little different, but it was making me think of that a lot, especially in the way that it was hiding their face at the start, and it was like, who is this faceless police officer who's doing this? So, it's a bit of a missed opportunity, or a bit to keep with the gun theme. It's a bit of a misfire, which is a shame.
I think, is it too late to change the name of the show to No Pun Intended? Because I feel like we just keep doing that.
I feel like it's easy with Dirty Harry. I don't know if it will be as prevalent with other properties and franchises, but I think we're getting to the point here where we can probably rate the movie film.
Sure.
So what are you going to rate Magnum Force out of 10?
So Magnum Force, for me, I rated Dirty Harry an 8. I'm going to go ahead and give Magnum Force a 7. I think that while it's still enjoyable, it's still good. There is a marked decrease or decline in quality from the last movie. I still enjoyed watching it. I don't think there was any point. There was no point in the movie where like I was stopping, checking the time, seeing like, oh God, how much longer is this going to go on for? Like the whole time I was at least intrigued by it, but it definitely, like I said, was missing some sort of spark that first movie really had. This felt a bit more, as you said, hollow, a bit more, unfortunately, sterile in how it treated like the world around it. It just was lacking in so many things, just that little bit.
It's a bit more Hollywood, I guess, as well. I guess is what we're saying.
Yeah.
Rather than being a filmmaker's film that's got something to say, it just felt a bit more like, no, we're making this for a profit. Here's Dirty Harry again, kind of thing.
This isn't Magnum Force, which happens to be the next Dirty Harry film. This is the next Dirty Harry film, which happens to be Magnum Force.
Yeah. So I'm going to go a little bit lower, actually. I'm going to go with a 6. Even though I share the sentiments, I just think the drop is a bit... I think a 6 is still perfectly watchable. I can still enjoy my time with a 6. There's some 6s that I love. I'd put this in that. I think this is a pretty watchable 6. There's some good ideas. There's some good sequences. There's some fun moments. Some of it's silly fun rather than genuine fun. But still, like I think it's worth enough watching. But ultimately, you've got a great movie, and then you've got a sequel that's all right, entertaining enough. So
yeah, I think what it came down for me, the reason that I do give it just that little bit over you, is that I think that the fun of it, the idea that it is still playing on the tropes of the first movie, while that can sometimes be a little bit distracting, I do appreciate the fact that they are at least still carrying on similar themes.
Yeah,
the idea of the cops are this extension of how Harry could end up if he were just taken to his extreme.
I appreciate that as well. It's sort of thing where I was maybe tempted with a 6.5 rather than the 6, but I think I'm landing on the 6 ultimately. I'm going to be a harsh critic on this show. I'm going to be stern.
I'll be the pushover.
Yeah, that's all right. But our second gauge, which I think it's clear to say, I think you could mistake this second gauge as like just like a second score out of 5. It's not that. Because I feel like where we land on this might make it sound higher than it is, probably. So I'm going to ask you if it makes the cut. And of course, the answers you might give me are a cut above, which is exceptional, must have. Makes the cut, which is, it's worth having. Cutting it close, which is, it's not worth cutting, but it's obviously whatever. And then you get cut from the collection, and then you've got absolute shit, which is cut your losses. So, David, does it make the cut?
So, for Dirty Harry, it made the cut very easily.
Very comfortably.
It slid right in. This one, I am going to say it does make the cut, but it's just barely sliding over the cutting it close section. I don't think that it's bad enough that it had to worry about like ever actually not making the cut in general, but it is still a notably decreased quality film where it's like, okay, if I were to get Dirty Harry, is Magnum Force something I would also want to get? And I think the answer to that is pretty safely yes. But I also think that if it were to continue on this sort of trend of just declining quality, that it's going to probably exit that category.
It's interesting because it's like at the end of the franchise, do you recommend just buying the first movie or do you recommend buying the box set because it's worth just getting the set?
Right.
That's the question. If this is the best of the sequels, and it may be, I don't know. Like, where do you stand at that point? I don't. We'll find out. For me, like, I actually also would say it makes the cut, despite the fact that I gave it a 6, because to me, making the cut is like, it's worth having. Again, if the rest of the sequels are terrible, it's maybe weird to just have the first sequel when it's not like this is not a T1 and T2 situation where it's worth having the two and then not the rest. But I would say it just about makes the cut. I don't think it cuts the close because I don't think it's bad enough to not want to just throw on as a sequel if you like the whole thing. So
it's the sort of thing I would say. Cutting it close in my eyes is the sort of movie where, like, if I were just going about watching random TV channels and it happened to be on, I would probably just leave it on. Whereas making the cut is something that, like, no, I want to be able to access this movie whenever I ever want to watch it. That's how I see the difference. And this movie, while it's a lot closer to the former than the latter, I think that it is still something that it's a solid enough made movie. While it doesn't feel great compared to Dirty Harry, it is still a good movie.
Okay. All right, there you go. That's Magnum Force, the second Dirty Harry movie. Next on the list is The Enforcer, which is the third movie in the franchise. So that's coming up. And remember that there will be a bonus movie for the month, which will be another Clint Eastwood action movie. It'll be The Gauntlet. You can get that over at the $3 tier and up over at patreon.com/MailFuzzTV when that goes out. You get bonuses for the other movie shows that we do on the channel, of course, as well. So go and have a look over there if you want to support all the content and keep everything coming. Have a look. You can also support us by hitting the super thanks button on the YouTube channel, or of course you can rate the audio version of the podcast on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast from. Give us 5 stars, all that stuff. You can get us on the Twitters at Screams Midnight for the Twitter for the channel in general. You can get me on Twitter at Wibble89. David, where can they get you?
I just hijacked your Twitter
That's
at
true.
DC Comics Podcast.
Fair enough. You can get David on that apparently. But yeah, so go do all that stuff, and of course I'll thank our Patreon producers for the month. Thank you very much to Tyler Hess, Cindy Palacios, Redacted, Board Now, Christopher Moy, David Brown, Al Tradesman, and Alison M. Fordyce. Thank you all for supporting the content and keeping everything afloat over at Mailed Fuzz Movies headquarters. But that is, which is here. But this is Mailed Fuzz Movies headquarters. Yeah. But so thank you very much for hopefully enjoying the show. We'll see you next time for the third movie in the franchise. There will be a vote on Patreon for our third theme / franchise. The reason why it's the third one is because we've got a little Christmassy one picked out for after this. So we'll give you more details of that probably by the time we're starting the next batch. But yep, so look forward to the Enforcer next week. But that has been the show. That has been the Collector's Cut. Thank you once again for joining us. Keep watching or listening. We always appreciate it. Keep watching movies. And I don't have an outro for this show yet. So bye-bye. And do you feel lucky, punks?